college life was a blur of textbooks, coffee-fueled all-nighters, and endless assignment. For the most part, I was the kind of student who flew under the radar, polite, hard-working, and always respectful to my professors. I wasn't a star student in every subject, but I was solid, consistent. And with graduation approaching, I was just a step away from something I'd worked my entire life for, a presidential degree. This degree was my ticket to a prestigious career, and my family had invested everything into helping me get there. I was acing most of my classes, but there was one major obstacle standing between me and that degree, a single class that I knew was going to be a nightmare: philosophy. I'd heard horror stories about the professor who taught it, Professor Raymond, a man with a reputation for being meticulous to the point of sadism. His nickname on campus was the Professor of Doom, and not without reason. No one liked him. Not the students, not the other professors. It wasn't just his demanding nature, but the sheer pleasure he seemed to take in watching people squirm under the weight of his unreasonable expectations. He despised anyone who wasn't at his intellectual level, and that, unfortunately, included most of the student body. But what could I do? Philosophy was a mandatory course, and he was the only one teaching it. If I wanted that degree, I had no choice but to face Professor Raymond head-on. The exam was looming, and I knew it was going to be brutal. I had spent months preparing for it. I practically lived in the library, buried under mountains of philosophy books, annotating every chapter, and breaking down every single lecture. I even memorized obscure philosophical theories, just in case Professor Raymond decided to throw a curveball question. I wasn't the only one who struggled. Every student in the class walked around with anxiety etched on their faces. Some whispered that Professor Raymond had a secret agenda, to prevent as many students as possible from passing. Others claimed he was just bitter about his own failed career as a philosopher. He once published a book that got universally panned, but he never talked about it. Regardless of the reason, I knew I was facing one of the toughest challenges of my academic career. The day of the exam arrived. I was nervous, but I felt prepared. I sat down in the lecture hall, along with my equally terrified classmates. The room was thick with tension. Professor Raymond stood at the front of the room, wearing his usual scowl as he distributed the exam papers. He didn't even bother with a pep talk. Instead, he gave a sly, knowing smile as if to say, "You're all doomed." As I opened the exam paper, my heart sank. The questions were far worse than I had imagined. It wasn't that I didn't know the material. I did, but the questions were deliberately tricky, full of ambiguous phrasing and philosophical trap. Raymond wasn't testing our knowledge. He was testing our ability to guess what he thought the answers should be. I wrote feverishly, trying to answer every question as best as I could, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. After what felt like an eternity, the exam ended, and I handed in my paper, my stomach twisted in knots. The fate of my presidential degree hung in the balance. A week later, the results came in. I had passed all of my other subjects with flying colors, but when it came to philosophy, I was just 2 points short of passing. 2 points. All because of Professor Raymond's impossible exam and his ridiculous standards. I was devastated. Without a passing grade in philosophy, my presidential degree was off the table. My future, the future I had been working toward for years, was slipping away right in front of my eyes. Worse yet, my parents were going to be furious. They had put their faith in me, and I had let them down. I tried to reason with Professor Raymond. I made an appointment to see him in his office, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could convince him to give me those 2 extra points. After all, I had studied hard. I deserved to pass, didn't I? But when I walked into his office, Raymond didn't even look up from his desk. He waved me off with a dismissive hand. 2 points may seem small to you, he said, in that condescending tone of his, but philosophy isn't about almost getting it right. It's about precision. You failed to meet the standard, so you failed the class. I was stunned. There was no compassion, no understanding. He didn't care about my future or the hard work I had put in. To him, I was just another student who had fallen short. Something snapped inside me that day. It wasn't just disappointment, it was rage. I wasn't going to let this man ruin my future. If he wanted to play dirty, fine. I could play dirty too. And that's when I came up with a plan. A plan for revenge. I had done some research on Professor Raymond after my initial meeting with him, and I discovered something interesting. He had a daughter my age. Her name was Claire, and she was a student at the same university, though we hadn't crossed paths until now. Claire was beautiful, popular, and, most importantly, the apple of Professor Raymond's eye. She was his pride and joy, the one thing in his life that he seemed to genuinely care about, and I realized, if I wanted to hurt him, I knew exactly where to strike. I made it my mission to get close to Claire. I found out what classes she was taking, what clubs she was involved in, and where she liked to hang out. It didn't take long for me to, accidentally, bump into her at the campus coffee shop one afternoon. "Oh hey," I said, pretending to be surprised. "You're Claire, right? We're in the same sociology class, aren't we?" Claire looked up from her book and smiled. "Yeah, that's right. I've seen you around." We struck up a conversation, and to my surprise, it wasn't hard to charm her. She was friendly, bubbly, and had no idea that I was only talking to her because of my vendetta against her father. As we chatted, I learned more about her interests, her hobbies, and her complicated relationship with Professor Raymond. "He's tough, but he means well," Claire said, with a roll of her eyes. "He's just really intense about philosophy. It's like his whole world." Good, I thought. That'll make this even more painful for him. Over the next few weeks, I made sure to run into Claire as often as possible. We started hanging out regularly, grabbing coffee, studying together, and eventually going on dates. It didn't take long for things to escalate, and soon enough, we were spending nights together. I could see the relationship forming, and I knew I had Professor Raymond's attention now. Word gets around fast on a university campus, and it wasn't long before Raymond knew that his daughter was seeing me, one of his students, the same student he had just failed. Sleeping with Claire wasn't enough, though. Sure, it felt good knowing that I had managed to get under Professor Raymond's skin by dating his precious daughter, but I wanted more. I wanted him to suffer the way I had suffered. I wanted him to feel humiliated. Claire, unaware of my true intentions, was easy to manipulate. She trusted me completely, which only made the next part of my plan easier. One night, after a few too many drinks, I casually mentioned that I had been married before. Claire blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Wait, you're married?" "Not exactly," I said, smirking. "It's complicated." It wasn't actually complicated. I wasn't really married, but there was someone else in the picture. Someone far more important to my revenge plot, Professor Raymond's wife. I had noticed Raymond's wife, Margaret, during one of my visits to his office. She had dropped by unexpectedly to bring him some papers he'd forgotten at home. Margaret was elegant, sophisticated, and still had that certain allure that made men turn their heads when she walked into a room. After my little dalliance with Claire, I decided it was time to up the ante. Sleeping with Professor Raymond's daughter was satisfying, but seducing his wife? That was next-level revenge. I started showing up at the local grocery store where Margaret shopped, coincidentally running into her as she browsed the aisles. At first, our interactions were brief and polite, but soon we started having longer conversations. She seemed lonely, probably because Raymond was too busy being an insufferable professor to give her the attention she deserved. It didn't take long before I found myself in her home, Professor Raymond's home. The same home where he probably graded my exam with a sneer of satisfaction. But this time, he wasn't there. It was just Margaret and me. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I had achieved the ultimate betrayal. I had slept with both Professor Raymond's daughter and his wife. The ultimate double betrayal. Of course, affairs like this can't stay secret for long. Raymond found out, and when he did, it was explosive. I heard through the grapevine that he had an epic meltdown in his office, screaming at his staff and throwing papers around the room. His perfect, carefully controlled world was falling apart. He had failed me in his class, but I had succeeded in ruining his life. Claire, devastated, refused to speak to me again. She dropped out of school for a semester, and as far as I knew, she never forgave her father for driving a wedge between us. Margaret? She filed for divorce. Apparently, she had been looking for an excuse to leave Raymond for years, and I had given her the perfect opportunity. As for Professor Raymond himself, he was humiliated. His colleagues whispered about the scandal behind his back, and his reputation as the strict, untouchable professor was shattered. His personal life was in ruins, and his professional life wasn't much better. But did I get my presidential degree in the end? No, I didn't. But I did get something far more satisfying: revenge. Sometimes that's enough. After the chaos of the Raymond scandal had finally settled, I had come to terms with one undeniable fact. I wasn't getting that presidential degree. My plans for a prestigious academic future had gone up in flames, but oddly enough, I didn't feel defeated. If anything, I felt empowered. I had taken control of my life in a way that most people only dream about. Sure, maybe my revenge tactics were unconventional. Sleeping with Professor Raymond's daughter and his wife wasn't exactly textbook conflict resolution, but it worked. And despite the wreckage left in my wake, I walked away with my head held high. What I hadn't anticipated, though, was the power of gossip. My story, my legend, let's call it what it was, spread like wildfire across the university, then the city. People couldn't believe what I'd done. Some called me a hero, others called me a maniac, but either way, I had made my mark. My name was on the lips of students, faculty, and even the local business community. And that's when he entered the picture. One afternoon, I got a phone call. The number was unfamiliar, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I said, half expecting it to be a telemarketer or worse. Another reminder that my student loans were due. "Is this you?" the voice on the other end asked. "Depends," I replied cautiously. "Who's asking?" "I've heard about your escapades," the man said, a slight chuckle in his voice. "I'm impressed." I blinked, taken aback. Who in their right mind would be impressed by what I did? I leaned forward on my couch, intrigued. "Who is this?" "Maxwell Trenton," he said, the name landing like a ton of bricks. I sat up straight immediately. Maxwell Trenton, the Maxwell Trenton. He wasn't just any businessman. He was a legend in his own right. He had built an empire from the ground up, becoming one of the city's most successful entrepreneurs. He owned everything from tech startups to luxury hotels, and his company, Trenton Enterprises, was one of the top employers in the country. People would kill for the chance to work for him. Mr. Trenton," I stammered, "how did you get my number?" He laughed again, a low, confident chuckle. "I have my ways. But let's cut to the chase. I've been following what happened with Professor Raymond. Word is, you didn't take failure lying down. You got creative. I wasn't sure if he was about to offer me a job or have me arrested." "Yeah, you could say that." "Look," he said, getting straight to the point, "I like people who don't let obstacles stand in their way. People who think outside the box. And let's be honest, the lengths you went to get back at someone who wronged you? That's commitment. I could use someone like that." You want to hire me?" I asked, my head spinning. "I want to meet you first," Maxwell said. "Let's talk. Tomorrow. My office. 10 a.m. Don't be late." He hung up before I could even respond. I sat there for a good 5 minutes, phone still in hand, trying to process what had just happened. Maxwell Trenton wanted to meet me. The next day, I found myself standing in front of the glass skyscraper that housed Trenton Enterprises. The building itself was intimidating, a towering monument to success and power. I straightened my tie, took a deep breath, and walked through the revolving doors into the pristine lobby. The receptionist, a sleek woman with a perfectly coiffed bob, greeted me with a smile. "Mr. Trenton is expecting you. Please, take the private elevator to the top floor." Private elevator? Of course. Why wouldn't Maxwell Trenton have his own private elevator? I stepped inside, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. What did Trenton really want with me? Did he see some potential in my twisted sense of justice, or was he setting me up for some kind of elaborate prank? When I arrived on the top floor, the doors opened to reveal Maxwell Trenton himself, standing at the entrance to his massive corner office. He was younger than I had imagined, probably in his early 40s, and dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. His salt and pepper hair gave him an air of sophistication, and his piercing blue eyes made it clear that he didn't miss a thing. "Welcome," he said, extending his hand. "Come in." I shook his hand, surprised at how firm and controlled his grip was. The man had presence, no doubt about it. He motioned for me to sit in one of the plush leather chairs in front of his massive desk, which overlooked the entire city. "I like people who think outside the box," he began, sitting down across from me. "People who aren't afraid to push boundaries, even if that means getting a little dirty. What you did at that university, that was bold." I wasn't sure how to respond. Thanks," I said awkwardly. He smiled. "I don't care if you were right or wrong. What I care about is that you didn't let the system crush you. You fought back. I need people like that in my company. People who don't take no for an answer. People who find creative solutions." I wasn't entirely sure if my creative solution of seducing Professor Raymond's daughter and wife was something I should be proud of, but I wasn't going to argue with a job offer from Maxwell Trenton. "I want to bring you on board," he continued. "I have a division that could use someone with your instincts." "My instincts?" I asked, unsure of what that meant. Maxwell leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "We deal with high-stakes negotiations, corporate espionage, competitive takeovers. It's not a place for the weak-hearted. Sometimes you have to play dirty to get the results you want. And from what I've heard, you know how to do that." Corporate espionage? Takeovers? I had no experience in that kind of world, but Maxwell's words made it sound like a game. A high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled game where the only rule was to win. And I had just been invited to play. The next thing I knew, I was working for Trenton Enterprises. My official title was Strategic Operations Specialist, but in reality, I was part of a shadow team that handled some of the company's most sensitive and controversial operations. Maxwell trusted me to deal with the things no one else wanted to touch. The gray areas where morality and business blurred into one. I had an office with a view, a generous salary, and a sleek company car. It was surreal. Just months ago, I had been a failed student with a grudge against a philosophy professor, and now I was rubbing elbows with some of the city's most powerful players. Maxwell was everything I had imagined and more. He was ruthless but brilliant. He didn't care about rules or tradition, he cared about result. Under his mentorship, I learned the art of negotiation, manipulation, and, yes, revenge. Though this time, it was directed at rival companies instead of personal enemies. One of my first assignments was to infiltrate a competitor's office and gather information about their upcoming product launch. It wasn't illegal, per se, just highly unethical. But Maxwell didn't bat an eye. In his world, you either won or you lost. There was no middle ground. One evening, after a long day of work, I went out to grab a drink at a high-end bar downtown, one of the perks of my new salary. As I sat at the bar, enjoying my whiskey, I glanced across the room and felt my stomach drop. Sitting at a table, laughing with some friends, was Claire, Professor Raymond's daughter. I hadn't seen her since the whole scandal blew up, and I wasn't sure how she'd react to seeing me again. Part of me wanted to duck out of the bar before she noticed me, but it was too late. She looked up, her eyes locking onto mine. For a moment there was silence. Then, to my complete surprise, she waved. I hesitated, then waved back. Before I knew it, she was walking over to my table. Well, 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 she said, smirking. If it isn't the guy who ruined my family. I laughed awkwardly, unsure if she was joking or dead serious. Hey Claire. Long time no see. Don't worry, she said, sitting down next to me. I'm over it. My dad deserved it. And honestly, I kinda admire your style. I blinked. You admire what I did? She shrugged. You took control. You didn't let him get away with ruining your life. Most people would have just sulked and moved on, but not you. You fought back. And honestly, that's pretty badass. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Thanks. So, she said, leaning in with a grin, how's the new job treating you? Apparently, Claire had kept tabs on me after the scandal. She knew all about my new gig at Trenton Enterprises and how Maxwell Trenton had taken a liking to me. It's wild, I admitted. Definitely not what I expected. She smiled, raising her glass in a mock toast. Here's to revenge, corporate takeovers, and getting what you want. As the months passed, I continued to climb the ranks at Trenton Enterprises. I became Maxwell's go-to guy for dealing with difficult situations, whether it was negotiating hostile takeovers or handling competitors who played dirty. In a way, I had become Maxwell's right-hand man, trusted with the kinds of tasks that would make most people cringe. But then, one day, I discovered something that made me cringe. While digging into some old files during a routine audit, I found a curious set of documents linking Maxwell's company to some questionable financial dealings. At first, I thought it was just normal corporate stuff, offshore accounts, tax loopholes. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that Maxwell wasn't just bending the rules. He was breaking them. And he wasn't doing it alone. One of the names that kept popping up in the documents? Professor Raymond. That's right. My old nemesis was involved in a shady deal with Maxwell Trenton. It seemed that Raymond, after being humiliated by the scandal, had gotten into some serious financial trouble. Maxwell had bailed him out, and in exchange, Raymond was feeding him confidential information from his university ties, specifically, insider knowledge about up-and-coming talent that Maxwell could poach for his company. I couldn't believe it. After everything, I had ended up working for the same man who had secretly been in cahoots with Raymond all along. I sat there, staring at the documents, trying to process what this meant. Did Maxwell know who I was when he hired me? Had he been using me this whole time? And if so, what was I going to do about it?